Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 18th of August of 2023. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. As you remember and as you know, the previous day was very difficult for the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians tried to implement at least two very big offensives, and the first one took place on the Bradley Square on the south of Orekhov, and the second one the Ukrainians were trying to implement in the vicinity of Velika Novoselovka. For some reason, the Ukrainians took a decision not to make a small operational pause, not to wait a little bit, not to complete regrouping. For some reason, after the Ukrainians managed to establish control over Urozhaine and to enter the north of Robotyne, the Ukrainians took a decision to continue pressure, to continue offensive operation. And as I understand, according to the results and based on the results, the Ukrainian officers and Ukrainian commanders were ready for that attack, but the soldiers on the ground weren't. And basically, during the previous day, yesterday, we saw a lot of battles. The tank battle in the vicinity of Orekhov, we remember this very interesting video. We saw the Ukrainian offensive operation in Urozhaine when the Ukrainians sent their forces among the fields to the certain deaths. The Ukrainians weren't ready to that attack. And today, the Ukrainians need to pay for the yesterday's situation, and they're paying. First, we're going to start with Bradley Square because today we have a lot of interesting updates from this area. Probably the most interesting video that we received from this bridgehead is the evacuation operation that the Russians implemented in the south of Robotyne. If you remember, yesterday somehow the Ukrainians managed to shut down the Russian helicopter, and to tell the truth, as I know, according to my calculations, this is not the first helicopter that was shot down by the Ukrainians during the previous months. As I know, the Ukrainians managed to shut down at least 2 or 3 helicopters, and as you can see, in comparison with the first stage of the Ukrainian offensive operation in this area, somehow the Ukrainians managed to improve their skills, and currently we see that the number of Russian losses with this type of weapon has been increased. We need, of course, maybe the Ukrainians managed to change the weapon, or maybe more experienced soldiers were redeployed to the combat line. Very difficult to understand, but anyway, as you can see, the Russians managed to complete a very successful evacuation. Usually the helicopter Ki-52, there are 2 pilots inside of this machine. One of them was killed as a result, died as a result of the accident, and as a result of Ukrainian shot, and the second one the Russians managed to save. If you remember, yesterday we saw a very interesting and significant video of the fightings in the vicinity of Robotyne in this area, the tank battle, when one Russian tank managed to destroy a lot of Ukrainian armored vehicles, and probably that was some operational or tactical reserves in armored vehicles of the brigade that was involved in that operation, because today the Ukrainians continued their offensive operation. They were attacking Robotyne, but when talking today, the Ukrainians mainly were using infantry. For example, in this video we see how the Ukrainian platoon was heading to the south in direction of Bradley Square, and the Russians were tracking them, following them, and the Russians managed to get some coordinates, and they start bombing and shelling these positions. But as you can see, the Russians a little bit missed, so there is some kind of a lag in time, and just probably as a result of artillery strike, just 1 soldier were wounded or probably killed. So the Ukrainians were moving from the north using just infantry, so that means that the Ukrainians landed their infantry somewhere in this area, and after that few kilometers, those soldiers under fire were moving to the south. Imagine yourself the quality of those soldiers who were fully loaded with machine guns, with grenades, with everything they need for, because they arrived in this area not just for 1 hour clashes. Probably they have replaced somebody, and after such a long trip under such a hot sun, imagine yourself the quality of these forces. And after that, of course, the Russians started bombing and shelling these infantry, these forces, with the drones. Anyway, you can you can have your opinion about the situation, about the Battle of Robotyne, but I see that this is just the regular massacre without any purpose. The Ukrainians repeat every single day the same things, the same step, and they're getting the same result every single day. So they're not even changing anything in this operation. Another way wave of attack, probably that was some kind of the last armored vehicle, the last Bradley of the brigade that was involved in that operation. One more time, the Ukrainians moved their forces in this area, then they landed the infantry. The Russians were controlling everything, and after a small pause, while the Russians were targeting this area, they destroyed probably one of the last Bradleys in the Ukrainian force of this brigade. Furthermore, the sources were saying that somehow the Ukrainians managed to enter the northern part of Robotyne, but they do have positions inside of the settlement, and the Russians were bombing and shelling the northern outskirts of this small village. On this video, we see how the Russians discovered the Ukrainian local operational machine gun position, and as a result of artillery strike, that building was just reduced to ruins. So as you can see, for now, the Ukrainians don't know how. They don't have possibilities how to dig in deeper in this area. This area, there are lots of artillery systems from the Russian side, and there is one, when talking about the battle of a certain bridgehead, there are some benefits, there are positive and negative sides of the battle in one place. As you can see on this video, another Ukrainian convoy, another Ukrainian platoon of infantry heading to the south, and at some moment the Russians start bombing them, and probably with the guided bombs. I'm not sure that anything could survive such a strike. So one more time, when talking about the battle of the same bridgehead for a very long time, and we know that the battle of Robotyne started on the 4th of June, and yet the Ukrainians are on the same area and the same positions. The benefits, the positive thing of this area is that Ukrainians already used this territory. They know the trenches, they know the positions. They have already demined by their own equipment most of the mine fields, so they know the safe ways, safe roads. And of course, from this perspective, this entire battle for them, we can say, become a little bit easier. But when talking about the Russian side, the battle for one bridgehead, a too long battle for one bridgehead, gives significant superiority for the forces who are in defense state. And the main thing is that artillery, mainly when talking about the Russians, we're talking about D20, D30 and M-Stab-B howitzers, those howitzers that you need to use some trucks, some cars, some buses, some vehicles to redeploy from one position to another. The Russians have some thousands of these pieces of these artillery systems, and the thing is that the Russians have redeployed significant number of artillery systems in this area. There are probably maybe hundreds or dozens of artillery systems, and their main purpose of these artillery systems to attack just at one position. You don't need to change focus to redeploy them, because if Ukrainians somehow destroy this or that D30 or D20 howitzer, they're so cheap. They were produced in the Soviet period of time, so they're very cheap. I won't be surprised if they're cheaper than AK-47. I'm just joking, but I'm just trying to give you the understanding of the price and so on. So let's assume that if there is a D20 howitzer somewhere in this area, the main purpose that the Russians need, they need to learn to teach these howitzer to attack just in this position. They don't need to do nothing else. They keep this howitzer in this area. If they need to stay here, they will arrive in this area. If they don't need to be there, they will leave. They will try to cover this howitzer with the leaves and something like this to, of course, try to hide from the Ukrainian drones. And this is the only task of one howitzer. Let's say another howitzer will be redeployed somewhere in this area, and from this position this howitzer should attack just in this point. So the Russians, since the beginning of June, have created hundreds of such points on the south of Robotyne, of Novopokrovka, Verbova, and the only thing they need is to calculate, to understand the Ukrainian movement, to get to the certain howitzer and to start bombing this area, and that's it. This is the key. Let's say this is so simple, and this is the key reason why the Russians are so successful in defense. Because one more time, let's take a look at video one more time. As you can see in this video, the Ukrainian infantry were moving along this line and using this road. The second video, the same road, but in this case there was an armored vehicle. So imagine yourself the number of forces from the Ukrainian side who use the same road to get to the south. So of course it's logical, it's obviously from the Russian side to establish fire control over this area, and at certain point of time to start attacking in this direction. So this is the reason of such heavy losses, and this is the reason why the Ukrainians anyway will not be able to develop the bridgehead. To continue their offensive operation further to the south, first of all, the Ukrainians need to destroy hundreds of artillery cheap D-20 howitzers in this area and to be sure for 100% that the Russians will not replace them with new one, and only after that they will be able to proceed. And from my perspective, from my understanding, this is highly unlikely the Ukrainians are able to implement this tactic. They need to change the front line. Currently, the Ukrainians can't agree and can't accept that they failed and they lost the Battle of Rabotina. And currently, they're trying to pay with Ukrainian lives, with lives of their soldiers, the highest price for this situation. The Russians reported that as a result of fierce fighting on the Rabotina front line of the Zaporozhye area, the Ukrainians lost 195 soldiers, 5 armored vehicles and 3 artillery systems. Now we're moving further to the Vremivka tactical bridgehead. Currently, the Russians are trying to implement almost the same situation in this area, but when talking about this area, there is no static front line. Everything, we can't say that the front line in this area, combat line in this area, is dynamic, because we see that it takes a lot of time to capture this or that settlement. But by the way, as you can see, maybe you haven't mentioned this, but I have mentioned this, that since the beginning of the special military operation, this not special military operation, but this greatest counter-offensive operation, the Ukrainians managed to increase a little bit their speed of offensive operation. For example, when talking about Vremivka tactical bridgehead, during the first 2 months, I'm talking about June and July, the Ukrainians managed to capture just like 4 towns: Starozhovo, Makarovka, Rovnoполь, Novodarivka. So 2 months the Ukrainians spent to capture these 4 settlements. But when talking about August, just for 2 weeks of August, the Ukrainians captured 2 settlements, Staromayorsk and Urozhaine. And the main reason of that, at least we can see that the period of time when the Ukrainians managed to increase the speeds of capturing the settlements completely correlates with the situation, with the piece of news regarding the approval from the United States of America to supply Ukrainians with the cluster rounds. If you want to hear my opinion, I see. Of course, I don't have real facts. We can't connect the situation. We need to make a real investigation, probably a real investigation, to get as much as possible numbers, as many as possible numbers. But as I see, based on the very maybe not very deep analysis, I see that the providing and sending of the cluster rounds to the Ukrainian side have increased this process. The situation has increased the speed of Ukrainian forces. And now the Ukrainians can make the front line a little bit more dynamic, which will force the Russians, which will not allow the Russians to establish and to use the same tactic as they're using on the Rabotina front line. I'm talking about static position of the howitzers that control every single forest line, every single brushes and so on. Because if front line changes, then they need to change your position of the howitzer, and you need to start targeting from the beginning. You need to attack at the point, trying to coordinate, to correlate, and it's not a very fast process. The Russians have already implemented and that process on Rabotina, and when talking about Vremivka, it's a little bit difficult. But now the Russians are trying to do everything they have to complete this coordination for the artillery system. And for these purposes, the Russians almost 24 hours, previous 24 hours, were bombing and shelling Urozhaine and Staromayorsk with guided bombs. Because the Russians understand, they have already read and understood and realized the Ukrainian tactic. They will continue, the Ukrainians will continue, and their main offensive operation, their main attack phase will go along the river Mokry. And for these purposes, they need to accumulate their forces in Staromayorsk and Urozhaine. They need to collect the critical mass, because without critical mass you can't continue, and this critical mass should be stretched from Staromayorsk to Makarovka. So basically the Ukrainians need to accumulate a lot of forces in this triangle, Staromayorsk, Makarovka, Urozhaine, to complete their offensive operation further to the south. And the Russians of course understand this perfectly, and currently and during the previous 24 hours the Russians made significant number of guided bombs bombs and tanks in these two settlements, and basically the Russians reduced these two settlements to ruins. So in this video see another usage of the guided bombs in this area. And if you remember, yesterday we saw the same situation when the Russians were bombing and attacking the Ukrainians in this area. So almost 3-4 days in a row, the only thing the Russians are doing in this area, they're bombing this territory 24 hours with guided bombs, with artillery systems, with missiles, with one purpose: to slow down the Ukrainians, to prepare another defense belt, and to get ready before the next Ukrainian offensive operation, which obviously will take place very soon. The Russians reported that as a result of fierce fightings in this area during the previous 24 hours, the Ukrainians lost 210 soldiers, 9 armored vehicles, including 1 tank, and 4 artillery systems. Very fierce clashes took place in this area. Very fierce clashes, but yet without very deep and very big offensives from the Ukrainian side. The Ukrainians from their side, to also understand the configuration of the Russian defense belt, their positions, and the Ukrainians continue bombing and shelling the Russian positions, those howitzers, those tanks from hidden positions along the forest lines, along the trenches, along the strongholds. For example, in this video we see the Ukrainians claims that as a result of artillery strike they managed to destroy another Russian armored vehicle. Now we are moving further to the south, Donetsk area, to Marinka. We have just one interesting geolocation from the west of Novomikhailivka. The Russians managed to discover the Ukrainian artillery system, and as a result of drone attack, as a result of Lancet strike, that howitzer, M777 howitzer, was destroyed. Very nice position for the howitzers in this system. We know that this howitzer has a very long range distance of attack, and basically from this position the Ukrainians were supporting their forces in the vicinity of Ugledar and in the vicinity of Novomikhailivka, and of course in the vicinity of Marinka. So that was probably a very good event from the Russian side, very good, great achievement to destroy artillery system in this area. When talking about Novomikhailivka, we haven't received nothing from this bridgehead for the previous 24 hours. More updates are coming from Krasnogorovka. The Russians, if you remember, for the previous months, they were storming the coal mines in this area. The Russians were attacking these anti-tank positions inside the settlement. The Russians were storming the Ukrainians along the railways. The Russians were trying to capture the stronghold on the east of the settlement. The Russians were attacking and destroying the Ukrainian artillery system behind the settlement. You know that the Russians implemented every single type of operation they could implement regarding this settlement. I'm not even sure whether anything have survived as a result of Russian fire during the previous months. This is probably, when talking about the entire special military operation, the front lines and so on, if you ask my opinion, as I see according to the concentration of fire and activity, I won't be surprised and won't lie you saying that probably this area, this small settlement like Krasnogorovka and Novomikhailivka is more, these towns are more important for the Russians, even more than Kupiansk front line. But Kupiansk is something like a media victory. It's something to show, something to talk about, like a counter-offensive operation. It's not, Kupiansk is not operation. Kupiansk is an idea, very great and very expensive idea that you can sell for very, very good reputation and media victory. But when talking about operational and tactical purposes, Krasnogorovka and Novomikhailivka, of course, they're priceless. And today the Russians published the video how they managed to discover another Ukrainian positions in the settlement in the industrial zone. They managed to discover the Ukrainian fuel depot, ammo depot, and the Ukrainian artillery positions Tulpan. And after that, the Russians started bombing and shelling this area heavily. As a result of artillery strikes, bombings, and so on, the Ukrainians probably lost all those facilities like fuel depot and ammo depot, and probably they lost their artillery system. I don't know how long the Russians are going to ruin this settlement. Probably if they understand the risk, if they understand that the Ukrainians do have possibilities to send the endless waves of reinforcements in this area, probably Krasnogorovka expect the destiny of Marinka. This settlement will be just reduced to ruins, because this is a stronghold that was created by the Ukrainians in 2014, and highly unlikely that this is going to be a very easy trip for the Russians, like a summer trip for the Russians inside of the settlement. But who knows? Also, the Russians continue attacking in the Avdiivka front line, and today we got a very unexpected piece of news from the Russian sources, from the very reliable Russian sources. There is a Telegram channel, 2 Major, and they reported that somewhere during the previous 24 hours the Russians launched an offensive operation, and that offensive operation was in direction of Ceramic. Very difficult to understand the purpose of that attack, the results of that attack, whether this is a real piece of information or just a speculation, because we stopped receiving from this area any updates. And for us, for everybody, like bridgehead between Ceramic and Alexandropol is something new, something undiscovered, and we even don't know the purpose of this attack. Sometimes we try to analyze this area, but yet we haven't seen any real movements from the Russian side in this direction. The Russians reported that as a result of fierce clashes on Donetsk front line, the Ukrainians lost 220 soldiers, 9 armored vehicles, including 1 tank. When talking about Artyomovsk area, the situation was stabilized by the Russians. The Ukrainians still controls the forest lines, trenches, and the stronghold on the west and west-north of Klishchiivka. The Russians are bombing and shelling this area heavily with the drones, with artillery strikes. For example, in this video, we can see how the Russians were attacking the Ukrainian positions in the forest with artillery. Probably that was artillery preparation. We haven't received any numbers, any updates regarding any attempts to clear this territory, but the usage of missiles probably is the first phase before the Russian counter-offensive operation. Anyway, the Russians, I understand, they control the situation, they see the real movements, they see the real regroupings, and as soon as they realize that it is safe to attack, they will. The Ukrainians from their side, as usually, controls the main supply roads that goes to Klishchiivka. On this video we see how the Ukrainians destroyed another tank that was heading in direction of Klishchiivka or somewhere, or probably in direction of Andreevka. As a result of that attack, that tank was probably damaged. On this video we see how the Ukrainians discovered the Russian position somewhere in the forest line. We see a small operational ammo depot among the forest lines. The Ukrainians discovered that the Russians were unpacking their machine, their ammo supply car, and after that they made artillery strike. As a result of that strike, the Russians lost operational ammo depot in this area. So for now there are no changes in the situation. I'm not even sure whether the Russians or the Ukrainians are going to launch any offensive operation, because if you ask my opinion, I don't see any purpose from the Russians to continue advancing in this area without any certain and real plan, like to capture Chasov Yar or Konstantinovka. Just to capture these forest lines, it will be another massacre, but from the Russian side. Also, the Russians published the video of their activity on the northern flank of Bakhmut, of Artyomovsk. If you remember, a few days ago, the Ukrainians launched a very powerful offensive operation in direction of Zaliznyánska. That attack was repelled by the Russians. The Ukrainians were attacking mainly along the road from Makiivka. And after that, during that attack, of course, the Ukrainians were using artillery system. They were using a lot of ammo depots to supply their forces on the combat line. The Russians have discovered everything, and after that, the Russians launched their own reconnaissance operation in this area. And for example, today the Russians published the video how they discovered the Ukrainian machine, the Ukrainian light vehicle, support light vehicle, maybe this armored personal carrier, who was who was transferring and redeploying forces from one position to another. The Russians started hunting them, started tracking them. At some point, they realized that this track moved in direction of Makiivka. The Ukrainians tried to hide that machine somewhere in the forest, and after that, the Russians launched artillery strike. One more time. This very interesting situation, for example, with Makiivka. The Russians managed not just to find like armored vehicle that was moving from one position to another. The Russians managed to discover the Ukrainian accumulation of the forces, and even in this case, the Russians attacked this territory with missiles, with artillery strikes, but not with the cluster rounds. I can't tell you whether it's good or not. Probably when talking about the legal side, to the casualties and the situation, that this situation can affect the population, it's a completely negative side. But when talking about from the military perspective of the Russians, they know that Ukrainians have already started using the cluster rounds massively, and the Russians haven't started doing this yet, and they see that the Ukrainian cluster rounds have already gave them some benefits. They managed to increase the speed of taking the settlements. I'm not sure what is the problem, and I'm not sure what is the answer to this question from the Russian side. Now we're moving further to Kremenaya Forest. Today, Ukrainians were pretty active in this area. They were bombing the Russian positions, mainly in the vicinity of Dibrova, and currently we understand the main Ukrainian purpose and the main Ukrainian plans in this area. As I understand, the Ukrainians are preparing before counterattack. If you remember, yes, recently we received update that a special brigade Azov was redeployed exactly in Kremenaya Forest in this area. This very famous brigade from the Ukrainian side, they are very popular because of Battle of Mariupol, and the main purpose, this is not the brigade of attack, this is media brigade, and the main purpose of this brigade is to create the feeling and the support, and to create a very nice powerful spirit of willing to fight and so on. So this is like a flag. This is like a flag to show the forces on the ground that we are together, and we together will do something. The Ukrainians continue massive artillery preparation of the Russian positions in the vicinity of Dibrova. The Ukrainians were bombing and shelling the Russian forces, the Russian positions in this area. Furthermore, the Ukrainians were bombing, destroyed another Russian artillery system. Some in Kremenaya Forest, the Ukrainians were bombing Dibrova itself. They managed to discover the Russian position, the settlement. So as I see, there is a process, artillery preparation, before Ukrainian attempt to attack in direction of Dibrova. And the main purpose and the main reason of that is the Tarskoye salient, this one. And this is a very big pain for the Ukrainians, and of course from one side this is a very big pain because the Russians have already split this territory in two parts, and from another side this is a very big pain because this salient has broken all the Ukrainians' logistic roads, and currently the only thing they want is to cut this salient and to encircle the Russian forces who are currently located in the vicinity of Tarskoye. So I do really expect the Ukrainian attempt to attack. This is not going to be probably a real offensive operation of the Ukrainians, of course. It depends how the things is going to develop. But anyway, the Ukrainians will try to attack because there are a lot of old brigades, a lot of old forces who are located in this area probably even since the beginning of the creation of these front lines, since the beginning of the previous autumn. And the Ukrainians just need to do this. They need to do this. They need to show at least some results in this area. The Russians reported that as a result of fierce fightings on the Liman front line, the Ukrainians lost 80 soldiers and 5 armored vehicles. When talking about Kupiansk, the front line that is covered with the fog of war, the Russians report about some advances, about it taking control over more strongholds and the checkpoints in the combat line. Yet we haven't received even a single video or photo confirmation, and this is very interesting, and we will discuss this in a minute. The only thing we have is that the Russians published the video how they managed to discover the Ukrainian artillery system, probably M777 Howitzer, and to destroy this artillery system as a result of Lancet strike. Now, what is so important and so interesting in the Kupiansk front line? First of all, the Russians almost every single day tell us that the Russians managed to advance. They capture another 1.5 kilometers in width, 3 kilometers in length. The Russians managed to capture 2 checkpoints, 3 strongholds, and so on. But we can't see this on the map because we don't know coordinates, we don't see coordinates, we don't see armored vehicles, we don't know the forces, and so on. And this territory is completely covered with the fog of war, and it's very difficult to judge whether this piece of information is correct or it's another speculation from the Russian side to change our focus or something like this. So I didn't have an answer to this question almost probably until today. Basically, the Russians in the autumn are going to collect all their parliament. So currently the summer vacation in the Russian parliament, and during the autumn period of work of parliament, they are planning to adopt one important law. And this law is about to make restrictions for the civilians of Russia, for press, reporters, for bloggers, to publish video and photo from the combat lines. Let's say from September, the Russians are no longer are no longer be available to publish video and photo even of such Lancet strikes, and the only source of information, and the Ministry of Defense is going to become the only source of publishing the real information. And as I understand, the Russians currently on the Kupiansk front line is basically something like a test area where the Russians are trying to test the system with complete absence of any information from the front line. They're testing the situation, then probably they will provide some information to the parliaments, they will investigate, analyze the entire situation, whether the absence of information helped them or not, and after that they will make conclusions, and as I understand, the conclusions will be to stop showing any photo or video from the combat line. And the only source, the Ministry of Defense, is going to become the only source of the truth from the Russia. Very interesting, very difficult. If you ask my opinion, as I understand, people anyway will try to search information, will try to find the pictures, and also from the Russians, even if you adopt this type of law, anyway the Russians have access to the Telegram channels, but this law can force and will force the Russians to join and subscribe under Ukrainian Telegram channels, because anyway you need to find some information, and they will subscribe. And we know that sometimes the Ukrainians, either the Ukrainians and the Russians show the only propaganda, and this situation can lead to negative consequences, like increase the level of Ukrainian propaganda on the Russian side. So this is very difficult and dangerous law, but from the other side, as I understand, the Russians probably don't have any other solution. They need to reduce the level of information from the combat line before the greatest Russian counteroffensive or just offensive operation in the territory of Ukraine that probably will take place somewhere in Sumy or Kharkiv area. Who knows? And anyway, we'll see. And one more time, probably the most important update is that the United States of America approved to start sending the Ukrainians with the F-16s. And this is completely another story, another special military operation. It will be the next phase, or even another completely different type of war when the Ukrainians get the F-16s. So we'll see. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds to condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for your watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.